Forests probably bring up images of vast swathes of green trees, wild areas where deer roam freely. Badgers and other creatures scurry around in the bush below, and foxes guard their cubs. We're familiar with forests, such as Sherwood, Avon, and not to mention the Royal Forest of Dean. But forests in the Middle Ages meant something quite different altogether. In fact, if you spoke about the Royal Forest of Dean,
I said not to mention it!
If you spoke about any forest in the medieval period, they'd assume you referred to hunting. It had very little to do with trees, despite what its name suggests. It was a legal term. The Magna Carta refers to forests only as a legal term. Some areas contained no trees whatsoever, even had communities living in them. Other areas were untamed expanses, ruled by wild beasts and whatever the overactive imagination of the medieval mind could conjure. Before we go any further, it would be a good idea to set the scene and describe what the rest of the kingdom would be like. Not everywhere is a city with guardhouses and walls, and not every home is a castle or manor. This is a day and age when not every field or furlong is protected by gates and fences, though there is a proverbial arms race with farmers competing against the wild. We've just not yet dominated the land, and often wild animals will make their way into a field and either eat your crop or kill your livestock. Worse, family. Maulings by wild pigs were common. Even in the towns and cities, wolves were a huge problem, and would continue to be until Edward I, Longshanks, decides to put an end to it. Still, the medieval world is as tame as it can be. Woodland is kept in check for the most part. You plant down trees for your future timber and fuel, then make sure you find a way of stopping the deer digging up the roots. Higher fences or hedges, they'll most likely find a way around it. Deer are all nice and cute until you were gored by a wild stag. Then all of a sudden, you want venison back on the menu. Not that you can do anything about it, as if the buggers belong to a forest, you want to avoid poaching. These described lands are the rural but civilised part of society, villages, towns, unwalled and prey to the elements. So just imagine what the forests are like. No wonder you end up with many tales of hungry wolves and other nefarious beasts. So with all that in mind, what exactly is a forest? As far back as Charlemagne, the word forest referred to the hunting grounds reserved for the king and nobility. These were aristocratic grounds, and the nobility guarded them jealously. And by Guillaume the Conqueror, the forest had evolved from a simple game reserve into a sub-branch of government, governed by its own laws, pretty much its own state. It would have had its own officials and keepers, from foresters to verderers. This was big business. And earlier I said it had little to do with trees, despite what the name suggests. Let's explore what the name suggests. What does forest actually mean? Well, it comes from Latin foris, meaning outside. Not in outdoors, but as in separate, outside of, apart. So it's a legal term, meaning a law outside of the usual body. Forest law was outside of the jurisdiction of the common law, the courts, solely dependent on the king. These were his lands, though he often appointed an officer to deliver just punishments. Just being an ironic term, it was far from just. So in a nutshell, a forest is a state within a state, governed by its own laws, swathes of land reserved for the king and his best pals to go hunting and enjoy vacations. And they'll end up building manors in the forests for purpose of these frolics.
Arrivederci.
You might be thinking to yourself, well, so what? Let the nobility bugger about their business. It's not getting in anybody's way. Leave them to it. Right? Yeah, it's not as easy as that. Royal forests were taking up vast swathes of the kingdom. In fact, almost all wooded land had ceased being ruled by the common law and was governed by the forest law. By King Henry II, a third of England was under forest laws. Towns and villages found themselves in the middle of these forests and paid taxes in order to operate. The entirety of Essex is a forest governed by forest law, with these harsh punishments. Oh, and the punishments? You poach a stag? The punishment is blinding. Yes, they will gore out your eyes. Richard Coeur de Lion upgraded this penalty to blinded and castration. Horrible punishments, although thankfully rabbits and hares were frequently poached and were seldom punished so drastically. Most likely would face a fine. And do take in mind what poaching was, though. It was hunting without the king's permission. You get permission, most likely purchased in the form of a license, such as granting a chase. Basically, given rights to hunt deer, and only deer. Or grant a free warrant, meaning you can keep dogs for the purpose of hunting foxes, hares and pheasants. Though, you can forget about wild boar. They've mostly been hunted to extinction, and the few that do remain are coveted by the king himself. And by the 13th century, they've gone extinct completely. And wolves. They weren't game. These were a pest, and Jar of Wales mentions them feasting on the corpses of fallen soldiers. Wolves were dangerous and often carried a bounty on their head. King John once paid 10 shillings for 2 wolves, a substantial amount of money, though he wanted them captured, not killed. That wouldn't have been an easy feat. As for things like collecting wood for fuel or timber, rules were set aside for that, and remember that farms also counted as forest in many cases, so obviously farm animals didn't count as game, so a butcher slaughtering a pig wouldn't have his nuts cut off. But should he and his mates head off into the woods and bag a deer, he'll lose his crown jewels like John in a wash. Talking of King John, he and his brother Richard found a nice little urner in the form of Disa Forestation. Disafforestation, not deforestation. No one is cutting down swathes of trees. It's basically selling off forest rights. So for a price, the land you were in could be no longer a forest, and governed by common law, not forest laws. Of course, this didn't stop John being a dick and pretending he hadn't just sold the rights. There's a reason forest laws are mentioned in the Magna Carta, especially in the Charter of 1217, when the barons pretty much wanted a return to the simpler times of Henry II, ditching all the current shenanigans. Under John, it had gotten so silly that people paid for lands to be disafforested and ended up having to pay again, or be punished for poaching. John always preferred fines over cutting off ghoulies. He loved money. So you ended up with situations where the peasants were attacking forester officials, driving them off. One woman made a ditch and was fined 100 marks, a huge amount of money. Sure, we don't know how big the ditch was, but I doubt it was the size of the Isle of Bloody Thanet. A straight-up John move. He was raking it in by abusing forest laws, so you can understand the barons wanting an end to the madness. Oh, and in case you're wondering, outlaws did exist, and many did take to the forests, although you don't always assume they're going to be Robin Hood archetypes. For instance, in the 14th century, 2 gangs roamed the Midlands, the Cotterell Gang and the Fulville Gang. They had hundreds of members, and were causing a problem. When the Justiciars decided to hammer them, the bandits quickly retreated to High Peak Forest, where they pretty much pulled a Rambo, living off the wild. More or less like your classic Robin Hood tale, except these guys are not given to the poor. They're scallywags. Giving it large, proper Harry the Pickle. Proper naughty. When they eventually do get nicked, only a quarter of the gangs get put on trial and no one is punished because they intimidate the judges. Before long, these scallywags have not only reintegrated themselves into society, but join Edward III on a military campaign. Eustace Folville, the gang leader, actually gives up crime, goes straight, gets knighted, while his partner in crime, Richard Folville, takes over the operation and ends up meeting his end in 1340. The gang tries to seek sanctuary in a church and ends up in a bloody shootout with arrows flying in all directions. Once this is done, they're dragged out and beheaded. So, yeah, you do have outlaws and forests. It's inevitable. It's a good way to hide. As you can probably guess, hunting was a lavish affair and far removed from what is depicted in the movies. We're not talking about a bunch of barbarians in skins and spears savagely hunting down anything that moves before retreating to the castle to pig out on a freshly caught wild boar. In reality, it was far more lavish even in this period. You might want to have luxury items such as silver-rimmed hunting horns or silver collars for your best dogs, good wines, because hunting is thirsty work, the best clothing. You might want cloth from Turkey, as Edward III did. You want to look your best. You're not dressed in armour for a hunt. God no, this is a pastime, not war. It's expensive, it's lavish. For instance, Edward III spends 80 quid a year on just keeping 70 pack dogs and their huntsmen. A huge pack, double the size of others. This is a statement of wealth. Women loved hunting also. This was no men's club. You start seeing other dogs, like spaniels, appearing, so called because they are said to have come from Spain. Greyhounds start appearing, setters. Dogs are becoming specialist in breed for different tasks. Anything from ratting to chasing foxes to exhaustion. None of these good boys come cheap. Hunting is a very expensive pastime, and bloody dangerous at times. It could easily land you a trophy for the castle wall, or a mortal injury from the tusk of an enraged boar that didn't get the memo that the spear was supposed to kill it. Take in mind no guns. You'd be using spears or bows, often on foot, as horses were not ideal in the thick woodland. You would have dogs, packs of dogs, but even in packs, an angry, territorial boar would gouge a few before thinking of going down. This was arguably as dangerous as jousting, especially in the earlier days from Charlemagne to William the Conqueror, a highly dangerous pastime. But of course, in comes gunpowder, and by the 15th century, hunting is not what it used to be. There'd be some old boys wagging their fingers at these newfangled things. Yeah, you want a good old hunt. Laws were changing, and eventually we lose our meaning of what a forest was. Now it's just a woodland on a larger scale. I can't imagine the high nobility rampaging on horseback through the Amazon rainforest, surrounded by packs of dogs, horns bellowing and shouting, all trying to corner some giant snake. Yeah, not quite the same, is it? So next time you're taking a stroll through Sherwood Forest, think about its origins as a royal game reserve and the dangers posed by wild boar and wolves. Plus the outlaws that may have once resided in these parts. Thank you for watching.